June 16th, 2006. An ominous, terrifying necropolis of the undead begins floating above the Plaguelands. September 7th, 2.5 months later, the EU guild Nihilum claims the world first on Kel'Thuzad. But that's only the conclusion of the story. What really happened in an era of non-streamed content and propaganda? In today's Legacy, we're going to be looking at the drama that unfolded in that final week in September. Find out the failures of Blizzard, the frustration felt by many players, and of course, the joy and heroism of what the guilds did during the first ever race to World First. As I sit here with the Emperor of Man, let's set the scene. Classic exists. Many of you listening to this have probably been and played in the Classic game, or even cleared Naxxramas yourselves. Yet that might have given you a skewed view of what life on Azeroth was like in 2006. WoW's launch is well known by now. They did what Blizzard did best. See what everyone else was doing and simply make it way better. The launch saw 8 million players invading its servers by the end of 2006. If you were an MMO gamer, there was simply no way to avoid World of Warcraft. I was one of these players. The game looked weak compared to the hardcore PvP MMO Neocron I was playing, but I'm not the only one. The legendary Kungan himself, while playing Lineage 2, also thought the same. The problems we both had were that all our friends were setting sail to make their new homes in Orgrimmar or Ironforge, and not joining in was simply stupid. The early raid clears of Molten Core, Ahn'Qiraj and Blackwing Lair were monumental feats, but the real impact of them were the stories they told. In the beginning, news of these moments were confined to realm forums, each segment of the community celebrating their server's champions. By Blackwing Lair, it spilled out into the general raids and dungeons forums, and high-end raiders were becoming legends in their own right. Remember that Classic had linear progression. No Blackwing Lair without Molten Core first, no matter when you joined. As those 8 million people poured into the game, they started from step 1. For nearly all players, scratching around for their first high-level blues was the progress track that they were destined for. Even to witness players wearing Tier 2 was like seeing a god walk among mere mortals. Players simply lived vicariously through forums and videos about bosses they probably wouldn't ever see, and as such, the prestige of those defeating them rose and rose. The Gates of Ahn'Qiraj war effort had such a lead up that speculation about who could defeat the old god first on a global scale began to mount. For the first time, the phrase "world first" was being discussed, and unlike today, many were in the running. Guild names like Drama, Curse, Risen, and Fury were all contenders, and interestingly, they were all US guilds. The EU hadn't claimed a single world first of one boss yet. The US Guild Fury picked up 5 of the 9 Ahn'Qiraj bosses in the first couple of days. 2 of the remaining 4 were optional bosses, so all eyes were on the Twin Emperors and Cthulhu himself. The late gate opening wasn't the problem it would be today though. Remember at this time raids were taking months to clear. Vodka, a stellar guild, managed to kill the Twin Emperors 6 days from it opening up, clearing the way to Cthulhu. And then, nothing. Except a word from our sponsor. Warframe, more specifically, the Whispers in the Walls. We are big fans of Warframe. They've been super nice to us, and we have put so many hours into Warframe over the last year or so that you guys just need to jump in. It's available now on all platforms, and they've got 10 years of content that they've been making that's all there for you for free. Huge cinematic set pieces and quest lines to go on that are super intriguing in this space adventure, and this is gonna be one of their new ones. Whisper in the Walls has mysteries for solving. Who is the man in the wall? Who are the Eldritch Murmur and the mysterious Albrecht Entrati? All these thrillers and things that you want to find out as you travel across the solar system. If you haven't jumped into Warframe before, you absolutely should. It's totally free. You get to play in these enormous suits that have so many cool and interesting features and weapons that you can all play in cooperative team play. And they're bringing out the new one, a 55th Warframe called Corvex that has like multi-layered radiation weaponry that you're going to get to play with, as well as a brand new void weapon called the Grimoire that you're going to be able to equip as like a tome type device and get going with it. So it's the beginning of Warframe's brand new narrative arc. I recommend you jump in and get involved with it, because honestly, when I did, I ignored this game for so many years, and when I jumped in and found out just how much content is here, how much they keep updating it, and how much stuff they bring with it, it's absolutely extraordinary. So Whispers in the Walls is available now on all platforms. Go and check it out, guys. You're not going to regret it. No C'Thun kill for 3 months. The Twin Emperors died on the 29th of January 2006. C'Thun, the 25th of April. It's just common knowledge now that C'Thun was just impossibly hard and Blizzard just did nothing. For 3 months. As an aside, it was Ian Hazzikostas, Watcher himself, long before working at Blizzard, that had mathed out C'Thun's current immortal status. Can you imagine the race to world first now with something like this? It really was the Wild West back then. The end result was a world first by some silly, petty EU guild named Nihilum. They were very big in the EU, but on the global scale? And why did they get it? Well, the answer is interesting. A hotfix to C'Thun went out to EU before the US, in the Wild West of Blizzard just pushing hotfixes whenever they were ready. C'Thun literally died as the US was logging in the next day. Oh, that pesky EU head start. But what of the other bosses, the optional bosses? Well, Uro died after C'Thun did. The day after, actually. After the hotfixes. But Viscidus died on the 5th of March, 2 months before C'Thun died, and a month after Twin Emperor. How many guilds killed it? One guild. One guild did the impossible, that the community thought just needed to be fixed. One guild managed to figure it out. Death and taxes had always been in the top contention discussion, picking up a world first on Firemaw in July 2005. Have you ever heard the phrase, kite it to Vale's room? Well, it's old school, but it comes from Death and Taxes. I'll link an article below for more details on that for those of you interested. Death and Taxes had proven themselves more than capable of getting that world first, their name being well known globally for the invested followers of the early kills. Disaster struck for them in AQ, however. The opening of the gates was different per server, depending on how popular the realm was and the contribution of the players to the war effort. Death and Taxes Gate opened much later than others, and with the EU early fix, C'Thun just wasn't possible. However, their Viscidus kill, that was shrouded in mystery even to its newest members, had shown them in a brighter light than anything else. They were so good, they had killed what was thought to be an unkillable boss. And thankfully, for those hungry raiders, the necropolis was coming.
You have no idea what horrors lie ahead. You have seen nothing. The frozen heart of Naxxramas awaits you.
It's important to remember that even by the end of Vanilla, 7 months after Naxxramas was released, less than 2% of the player base even went inside. Nax was for the best of the best of the best. At this point, the player base is still exploding at the same rate it had since the game was released 2 years earlier. It should be noted that the player base didn't mind that there were raids they couldn't ever hope to see. They had plenty of content from Molten Core to Ahn'Qiraj for them to do, and similar to today's Mythic raids, the rest of the player base was happy to see what their realm heroes would achieve. This was it. The first real race to world first. Global eyes on what these players were doing. And all we could do as non-raiders was watch in awe as these people went in and we got kill updates via the forums. This was about the time when there was gentlemen's agreements going on between the guilds. Nobody would release a video of a boss kill until that boss had been killed 5 times. And then it was the precedent of whichever guild had killed it first to release their video first. No live streams, no live updates. Only way you could get information if you were stuck on a boss was to whisper a friend or somebody in that guild and hope they would give you info, or friends share little things. Where do you start? Naxxramas has 4 wings open to you when you get inside. And without live streams like we have today, where you can watch the top guilds go here, try this boss, try that. So by the time you get in there, you know exactly where to go. This time, it was different.
Afterlife head to the Spider Wing and make short work of Ahn'Qiraj Khan, but find Fairlina to be their first wall. Fury head into the Death Knight Wing and crush Resuvius, but Gothic is a weird boss. Needs raid balance the game hasn't seen before, so they get stopped. Surreal, they decide to go to the Plague Wing, kill Noth really quick. But we all know that the next up is Hygen the Unclean. Not only is the dance tricky, but at launch Hygen would lag the whole game out. After the first day, 3 bosses are down. Only Patchwork, the biggest output chain the game had ever seen, remained standing of the first wing bosses. The following day, Afterlife, who had stayed and pushed the Spider Wing, managed to kill Fairlina, and then nothing for 2 days. By this time, word was spreading fast that Nax was hard. Really hard. In Ahn'Qiraj, half the raid was dead and cleared by day 1, and here we are day 3 and only 4 bosses have died. Rumours were spreading that Nax was a literal meat grinder. The shock came on day 4. Death and Taxes rose. Patchwork, the boss already being called the monster of the raid, was defeated, and shockingly, they killed Grobulus and Gluth on the same day, showing that Patchy was indeed harder than the bosses he protected. Death and Taxes were now staring down at Thaddeus. Well, we'll come back to that. The final boss of the reset to die was Mexner, by forgotten heroes, and after an entire week with the best of the best, pushing 8 bosses had died, and no sign yet of Nihilum, the EU champions. Although the record book of first kills doesn't show it, Nihilum were chasing, just behind everyone. As the US domination seemed to be repeating, and maybe this time no strange bugs would give EU a win. Deathly silence on progress for 6 whole days. Again, unheard of in the modern era. 7 bosses alive and no kills? For those who have recently played Classic WoW and maybe even smashed Naxxramas, you may be confused. Nax has been done. Analysed, reanalyzed, guides have been made, articles written, private servers farmed for years. The increased difficulty of modern raids and so on and so on. In 2006, players just didn't have the knowledge or the resources the modern audience has. Just look at these videos of the first kills. No range trackers for healers to see who they could heal or if they couldn't. No world buffs, no flasks. That kind of thing just wasn't done. It was unheard of. Flasking a whole raid was well beyond the reach of a raid guild in terms of costs and resources. Day raiding wasn't a thing outside of the first day. The min-maxing of characters that has been studied and refined for 20 years just didn't exist yet. They were not only playing blind, but also with a power level drastically lower than what those of you in Classic probably used. On the 30th of June, 10 days after the raid had opened, Death and Taxes did it again. They did something the other Nax guilds wouldn't do for months. They defeated Thaddeus. Just think of how Thaddeus works. Its main mechanic, polarity shift, constantly changing whom you could stand next to in the chaos that is a 40-man raid. Now do it with 0 add-ons. Although add-ons did come later in vanilla, they certainly weren't around in the first few days. And then add the crappy PCs people were playing on in 2006, and it shows just how good they were. At this point, They were killing bosses nobody else could, and they seemed the early favourites to take it all. Fury had stuck to the Death Knight wing and managed Gothic on the same day. 10 down, 5 to go, but the difficulty is spiking hard now. A few days later, after some hotfixes, Risen showed their name by bringing down Hygen the Unclean. This opened the door to the consumable, demanding Lowertheb. The hotfix allowed others to pass through Hygen shortly after. Guilds got to farming shadow protection potions for the 40 people to chug, and it was Deus Vox who brought down the final Plaguewing monster of a boss, 2 weeks after Hygen had died. That's right, my friends. It has now been a month since Naxxramas released, and there are still 3 bosses standing. The forums were ablaze. How the hell do you deal with the Four Horsemen? So many guilds had reached them and everyone had been humbled, and humbled fast, by the former heroic souls atop their steeds. And this is where the raid takes a historical, dark turn. Tanks. Warriors. Especially those with some Naxxramas gear were disappearing like some alien invasion. Guilds were being raided across the realms. Remember, this is the pre-realm transfer, so these thefts were crippling the guilds on each server. Suddenly, guilds with a little bit of Nax progress couldn't go any further as their warriors were all vanishing, and they had to recruit from lower down the tent pole and re-progress. It became apparent that the guilds working on Four Horsemen needed those warriors, and as such, were poaching from their competition rather than hoping to eventually get the gear on reclears. While strats are different in the 2020 version of Nax, back then 8 warriors were desired. The reason was that Nax warrior tier sets had a bonus where their taunt ability wouldn't get resisted, and the horsemen needed it. The gap between the top and everyone else just got wider. While the top guilds poached and moved forward, the lower down guilds fell further behind. Guilds were complaining endlessly of how they were being hamstrung, but it didn't matter. The hardest race in history was still going strong. And then, out of nowhere, like a sudden air raid siren blaring through the streets, the forums were reignited into a frenzy. 5 weeks in. The news spread across the world almost instantly. Death and taxes had done it. The Four Horsemen were dead. All 4 wings were clear, and Sapphiron was available.
I truly wish I could let you know how exciting this was and frustrating at the same time. We had been following this race for months, and all we could do was sit back and refresh the web pages over and over again, waiting for some kind of update. Had this boss died? Why were the Four Horsemen so difficult? What was causing these guilds to get stuck? And more importantly, what was this undead dragon going to be like?
Like the absolute pros they are, Death and Taxes released a teaser video of the Sapphiron formation for the world to see. And what a spectacle it was. It probably looks kind of mid to people now, but in 2006, there was nothing like this animation in the whole game. It was simply amazing. We all sat back in awe at what these champions were facing down. Frost resist was the key, and thankfully the guild Dread of Kor'gath lent their frost runes to Death and Taxes to build their frost resist armor for the fight. After a full week of crafting this new armor, re-clearing the raid, Sapphiron fell. The block for it being just frost resistance rather than mechanical difficulty, a sort of wet end to what was about to come. But the gates were open to Kel'Thuzad. But 2 days later, Sapphiron fell again. The EU guild Nihilum were right behind them.
What we're about to discuss is probably the most frustrating and disheartening thing you will ever hear of happening in World of Warcraft. But one thing to remember is that by today's standards, this could never, ever happen again.
Back in old WoW, though, it will not be the last time. The issue is genuinely propaganda. No streaming, no regular updates, so info on what was happening between these two guilds was leaks and hearsay. It was also relatively common to have faked screenshots and lies be told by the guilds to rattle the competition. So how do we get the truth, my friends? Well, we go to the source. I reached out to both Death and Taxes and Nihilum, to the soldiers who were there that fateful week to find out what really happened. I want to give this moment a shout out to Lenny from D&T and the crew of his old members who answered any questions I had. Also a shout here to Close from Nihilum, who bought me many Danish beers in Copenhagen recently, making me very drunk, but also accepted my gift for his new baby, which became their favourite Christmas present. Smiles, Kenny. 5 days. 5 days. After this 2.5 month journey from Naxxramas release, it was just 5 days from Sapphiron falling for Kel'Thuzad to end up in his phylactery. Both guilds agree that Kel'Thuzad wasn't particularly hard, especially compared to what they had already faced, and you recently saw the hardcore version die on its first pull. So what happened? Forum chatters would have you believe that Nihilum just played better and won in the end. Hell, it's what I thought for a long time. Radio silence was coming from the US, but in the EU, screenshots were being released of Nihilum getting Kel'Thuzad to 1%, not just once or twice, but a few times. If it wasn't that hard, and Nihilum arrived second, and D&T had cracked the hardest bosses in this raid so far, then how? How could it be that they didn't win? Were they just burnt out? Did they just drop the ball on the last boss? Well, neither. You see, my friends, it is extremely hard to kill a boss that doesn't exist. Death and Taxes approached Kel'Thuzad full of fire in that frosty tomb he called a home, and they got to work. The first couple of pulls, they are seeing what he does, getting their positioning down, and after pull 5, though, something strange happens. Kel'Thuzad just doesn't respawn. And his gate to his room is closed. Death and Taxes stare through the bars at an empty room and no boss.
These days, during the Race to World First, the players have access to a Discord that has the developers in there. Should there be something important happening, they can have instantaneous communication. We saw that with the most recent Race to World First. Tindral was lagging everybody out, the devs are on it, and they feed that back to the players. There are going to be nerfs to the bosses, they find out. Are the players doing something that is not allowed? The devs can feed back immediately to stop doing that. But back then, you had to email customer support, and D&T tried everything. They emailed, they called the hotline, they tried reaching out to Bill's brother's sister's cousin who has a wife who may know somebody who works at Blizzard. To nothing. 4 days. 4 days. Death and Taxes, who had reached the last boss first, zoned into Naxxramas to stare at a closed gate and no boss behind it. Any lead they had built through their sheer amazing gameplay was lost.
Nihilum didn't have this issue. Yet. The boss didn't bug out in the EU. For a couple of days, Nihilum got to progress and work on the boss that Death and Taxes couldn't even attempt. Despite the rumours of a fake screenshot, Close confirmed it was absolutely true. Nihilum did have several 1% wipes before again, disaster. On the Tuesday, just before the EU reset, Kel'Thuzad didn't respawn and their gate closed as well. The difference being, Death and Taxes hadn't even seen past Phase 1, despite their early arrival. With the EU reset coming, Nihilum sprung to action. Close called into work sick, as did many others, so they could day raid. Again, at the time, a super hardcore move, and even more extreme than that, they got world buffs and flasked the whole raid. This is absolute absurdity. Mountains of nerd sweat never before seen in this game. They fully re-cleared Naxxramas that morning, and on the 7th of September, Kel'Thuzad was defeated. This was such a monumental moment that their server was flooded with level 1s to share in the celebration of EU dominance of the raid and over the US guilds. Nihilum killed Kel'Thuzad just as Death and Taxes reached his gates again. Can you imagine how this must have felt for those players? They had pushed. They had killed. They had figured out the hardest bosses of this raid before anyone else. 2.5 months of slogging away, farming, refarming, crafting, negotiations, tactics, and discussion, only to stand staring at an empty room for nearly 4 days, and then have all the glory taken away. I quote here from Lenny, who recounted to me that moment and how they felt. We were pretty deflated, as you'd say. So once we got the bad news, people weren't playing as well. There was a bit of an argument about how much frost resistance we should wear for a moment. Overall, the hit to our morale cost us US first, since another guild snagged that after learning the strategies for the Four Horsemen, Sapphiron, and then probably had an easier time with Kel'Thuzad from the momentum of their catching up. You heard it right. Death and Taxes was so down they didn't even get the US first. A crushing and terrible stain on the history of the race to world first. And thankfully, this is something that couldn't happen now.
The first ever race to world first will go down in history as cementing Naxxramas as when the game took to the next level. For the first time ever, millions of gamers gathered around like armies to watch their heroes battle against these large monsters. Yes, it's filled with frustration for some, joy for others, but as we all know, that's not where the story ends. Next time, we're off to the Burning Crusade. Betrayal, manipulation, happiness, victory. It's all going to happen for us here. So thank you everybody who's supported us in our journey, and we'll see you again next time. Goodbye.